안녕하십니까. 저는 오늘 행사 사회를 맡은 아나운서 이채영입니다. I'm your MC 최영미. 어제까지 참 많은 비가 왔습니다. 오늘 뜻깊은 행사에 참석해주신 내외 교민 여러분들께 감사 말씀드립니다. 그럼 먼저 오늘 컨퍼런스 진행 순서에 대해 간단히 안내해드리겠습니다. 한국지식재산연구원 최덕철 원장님과 국가지식재산위원회 윤종영 위원장님을 대신한 고기석 국가지식재산위원회 단장님의 인사 말씀에 이어 김영민 특허청장님의 기조연설이 있겠습니다. 첫 번째 세션은 주요국 IP금융 생태계 조성을 위한 경험 공유를 주제로 영국, 미국, 중국에서 오신 IP금융 전문가들의 발표가 12시까지 진행되겠고요. 점심 식사 이후 2시부터 진행될 두 번째 세션에서는 국내 IP금융 생태계의 현재와 미래에 대해 국내 연사의 발표와 종합 토론이 4시까지 진행되겠습니다. 그럼 지금부터 IP금융 국제 컨퍼런스를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 오늘 행사의 주관기관인 한국지식재산연구원 최덕철 원장님의 개회사가 있겠습니다. 최덕철 원장님을 큰 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
한국지식재산연구원과 한국발명진흥원 그리고 새롭게 출범하는 한국지식재산학회가 주관하는 2014 IP금융 국제 컨퍼런스에 참석해주신 내외 기민과 참가자 여러분께 감사의 말씀을 드리겠습니다. 특히 바쁘신 가운데도 자리를 보내주신 국가지식재산위원회 고기석 단장님 그리고 기조연설을 해주신 김영민 특허청장님과 국내 모든 연사분들께 감사드립니다. 오늘날 세계 각국은 지식경제 시대의 도래와 글로벌 경제의 가속화로 인해 새로운 도전에 직면하고 있습니다. 우리나라 또한 기존의 유수 불평 성장에서 혁신 주도형 성장으로 전환해야 하는 과정적 상황에서 지식재산을 보유한 혁신형 기업들이 우리 경제의 중추를 형성하고 산업 전반에 거친 성장을 견인하지 않는 국가 경제의 지속적인 성장과 선진국 진입은 단로될 수 없을 것입니다. 우리는 현재 이러한 변화에 대한 해법을 기술 혁신에서 찾고 있으며 OECD 국가들 중 가장 높은 수준을 보이고 있는 GDP 대비 R&D 투자 비율은 기술 혁신을 위한 우리의 의지를 보여준다고 하겠습니다. 하지만 이러한 노력에도 불구하고 세계적인 저성장 기조, 인구의 고령화및 청년 실업률의 증가와 같은 경제 상황은 우리를 여전히 미래의 불확실성과 직면하게 하고 있다고 하겠습니다. 이에 오늘 우리는 이 자리에서 국가 경제의 지속성장과 창조 경제 실현을 위한 하나의 수단으로서 IP금융에 대해 논의해보고자 합니다. IP금융은 기술 혁신을 가능하게 하는 중요한 요소이자 창조 경제의 핵심 요소들을 연결해주는 중요한 기능을 한다고 생각합니다. 우리는 IP금융을 통해서 상상력과 아이디어를 실현하고 이를 다시 혁신 활동에 투자하여 지식재산을 확보하는 선순환 생태계를 조성할 수 있으며 기업들은 보다 안정적인 환경에서 좋은 기술과 특허를 확보할 수 있을 것입니다. 창조 경제의 성공 연구는 이러한 고품질의 지식재산 확보를 통한 국가 경쟁력 강화에 달려있다고 해도 과언이 아니며 지금은 우수한 지식재산의 확보 및 활용을 위한 IP금융의 활성화 및 금융 생태계 조성과 관련된 국가적 차원의 노력이 절대적으로 필요한 시점입니다. 저는 오늘 각 세션에서 논의하게 될 주제들을 통해서 지식재산 중심의 국가 발전 전략에서 IP금융의 중요성을 확인하고 IP금융 활성화 및 금융 생태계 조성을 위한 도전 과제들을 발굴하여 한 단계 도약하는 창조 한국을 위한 해법을 찾을 수 있기를 기대합니다. 마지막으로 오늘 참석해주신 모든 참가자 여러분들과 오늘 이 컨퍼런스가 마련될 수 있도록 아낌없는 지원과 협조를 보내주신 여러분들께 다시 한번 깊은 감사를 드립니다. 감사합니다.
네, 한국지식재산연구원 최덕철 원장님의 개회사였습니다. 원장님 좋은 말씀 감사드립니다. 다음으로 오늘 컨퍼런스를 축하해 주시기 위해 국가지식재산위원회 윤종용 위원장님을 대신해서 국가지식재산위원회 고기석 단장님께서 축사를 대독해 주시도록 하겠습니다. 고기석 단장님을 따뜻한 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
국가지식재산위 위원장님께서 아침에 전화를 주셨습니다. 아마 어젯밤에 이렇게 아주 심한 감기가 오셔가지고 불구하고 참석을 하시려고 하셨는데 목이 완전히 잠기셔서 말씀을 거의 못 하시더라고요. 정말 죄송하다고 여러분들께 좀 전해달라고 말씀을 하셨습니다. 너그럽게 이해해 주십시오. 존경하는 김영민 특허청장님, 그리고 Managing Director Kelvin King from Valuation Consulting, and Jung from the IBCTL, and Lei Xiaoyun, the Untitled Chapter Director. 그리고 여기 모여주신 많은 우리 전문가와 기빈 여러분, 2014년 지식재산 금융국제 컨퍼런스 개최를 축하를 드립니다. 그리고 이 자리에 함께하게 되어서 매우 기쁩니다. 우리나라는 그간 창의적인 아이디어를 우수한 지식재산으로 만들어서 세계 4위, 5위권의 국제 특허 출원 국가가 되었습니다. 또 그동안 꾸준한 투자를 통해서 R&D 투입에 대비해서 보면 특허 출원 세계 1위라는 놀라운 양적인 성장도 거두었습니다. 이제는 창출된 지식 재산이 창조경제의 진정한 유통화폐로서 시장에서 활발하게 활용되는 것이 매우 중요한 시점입니다. 전 세계 특허 자산 총액 10조 달러, 세계 특허 시장 규모 2조 달러. 이런 시대를 맞아서 지식재산이 제 가치를 인정을 받고 그것이 또 시장에서 창업, 사업화, 거래될 수 있도록 해주는 금융 생태계는 아무리 강조를 해도 지나침이 없을 것입니다. 정부도 창조경제를 새로운 국가 성장 전략으로 삼아서 우리 위원회는 물론이고 특허청, 그 다음에 문화체육관광부, 산업부, 중기청, 기재부, 공정거래위원회 많은 부처들이 함께 지식재산 관련 정책을 적극적으로 발굴, 그리고 수립, 이행해오고 있습니다. 특히 이때까지 존재감이 상대적으로 크지 않았던 IP 기술 가치 평가의 신뢰도를 높이자. 그래서 시장 중심의 지식재산 금융 생태계가 조성될 수 있도록 하자라는 의미에서 작년부터 범부처 합동으로 일을 해왔고, 지난 4월에는 대통령께서 주재하신 과학기술자문회의에서 시장 주도 개방형 가치평가 체제 구축에 대한 대책을 확정하고 현재 추진 중에 있으며 아마 이번 달 중에는 대부분의 작업들이 완료가 될 것으로 예상을 합니다. 이를 통해서 현재의 정책금융은 물론이고 거기에서 더 나아가서 앞으로 지속 가능한 민간 주도의 선진 금융 시스템, 선진 평가 시스템으로 발전해 나가기를 저희는 희망을 하고 있습니다. 모쪼록 오늘 컨퍼런스에서 IP금융에 대한 주요국의 경험, 그 다음에 국내 현황을 함께 나누고 지식재산 금융정책의 미래에 대한 다양하고 실질적인 논의, 그리고 그것을 통해서 우리가 통찰력과 해안을 얻게 되기를 바랍니다. 끝으로 IP 더하기 파이낸싱 하면 여전히 IP입니다. IP 더하기 파이낸싱 하면 Intellectual Property에 파이낸싱을 더하면 여전히 IP인데 거기서 IP는 Infinite Possibilities라고 저희는 생각을 하고 있습니다. 오늘 이 행사를 준비해 주신 여러분들의 노고에 감사를 드리고 우리 모두에게 매우 유익한 시간이 되기를 기대합니다. 감사합니다.
국가지식재산위원회 고기석 단장님의 진심어린 축하 말씀 감사드립니다. 이제 기조연설이 이어지겠습니다. 기조연설은 오늘 행사를 주최한 특허청의 김영민 청장님께서 해주시겠습니다. 청장님을 큰 박수로 모시겠습니다.
거기서 국가지식재산위원회 전략단장님을 비롯하여 업계, 학계, 정부 측의 여러 기빈들을 모시고 우리 창의적 아이디어 실현을 위한 지식재산 금융 생태계 구축에 대하여 논의하는 자리를 가지게 된 것을 매우 기쁘게 생각을 합니다. 방금 축사에서 말씀해서 강조해 주셨듯이 현 정부가 우리 경제의 새로운 발전 패러다임으로 제시한 창조 경제 달성을 위해서 정부뿐만 아니라 기업과 국민들을 포함한 모든 경제 주체들이 힘써 노력하고 있습니다. 오늘 이 자리 역시 창조 경제를 실현하는 구체적인 노력의 일환으로 국내외 전문가들을 모시고 지식재산 금융의 발전 방향에 대한 고견을 듣고 지식재산 금융 생태계 구성을 위한 방안을 같이 고민하기 위해 마련되었습니다. 오늘 여러분들께서 말씀해 주신 귀한 의견들이 우리나라 지식재산 금융을 한 단계 발전시키고 나아가 창조경제 달성에 초석이 될 수 있는 지식재산 금융 생태계 구축에 큰 도움이 될 수 있을 것이라고 기대합니다. 사실 제가 이러한 자리에서 지식재산의 중요성에 대해 말씀드린 것이 새삼스러운 일은 아닙니다만은 최근 KDI에서 나온 연령별 소비 성향의 변화와 그것이 경제적 시사점이라는 보고서를 읽고 흥미로운 점을 발견하였습니다. 보고서에서는 미국의 40대는 처분 가능 소득의 2.1%만 교육비로 지출하는 반면에 우리나라의 40대는 처분 가능 소득의 14%에 달하는 금액을 교육비로 지출하고 있다고 기술하고 있습니다. 물론 우리나라의 교육비 지출 비율이 높은 것에 대해서는 다양한 설명이 있겠습니다만 제 개인적인 생각으로는 이러한 교육에 대한 아낌없는 투자의 주요한 요인은 우리나라의 학부모들이 세대를 걸쳐 지식의 중요성에 대해 공감대를 형성해 왔기 때문이라고 생각합니다. 경험적으로 돈을 물려주는 것보다 자녀들이 지식을 가질 수 있는 교육 기회를 주는 것이 더 낫다는 사실에 대해 의문을 가지는 부모님들은 그다지 많지 않을 것입니다. 이러한 지식의 중요성에 대한 생각은 비단 이 가정에서만 적용되는 것은 아닐 것입니다. 지금도 여전히 진행 중인 삼성과 애플의 특허권 분쟁이나 구글이 모토로라를 인수했다가 재매각하면서 특허의 대부분은 그대로 보유한 사례 등을 보았을 때 이 세계 초인류 기업들에 있어서도 그 경쟁력과 기업의 미래를 결정짓는 것은 지식재산이라는 것을 방증하고 있습니다. 무한 경쟁이라는 글로벌 시장 환경에 노출되어 있는 우리의 중소기업들 역시 세계 무대에서 경쟁력을 갖춘 기업으로 성장하기 위해서는 경쟁력 있는 지식재산을 확보하여 기업의 핵심 역량으로 삼는 것이 선택이 아닌 필수적인 일이라고 살 수 있습니다. 현재 특허청을 비롯한 모든 경제 관련 부처들이 협력하여 창조경제 생태계 구축을 통해 우리나라 경제구조를 선진국 추격형 경제가 아닌 세계시장 선도형 경제로 변화시키기 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 창조경제 생태계는 창의적 아이디어가 R&D 과정을 거쳐 기술로 개발되고 이러한 기술이 다시 사업화 과정을 거쳐 상품으로 시장에 출시되며 이를 통해 새로운 시장과 일자리가 창출되는 일련의 과정이 유기체와 같이 살아 움직이는 경제 메커니즘이라 할 수 있겠습니다. 유기체, 즉 생명이 살아 움직이게 하기 위해서는 혈액이 공급되어야 하듯이 창조경제라는 유기적 경제 메커니즘이 작동하기 위해서는 바로 혈액의 역할을 하는 자금이 원활하게 공급되어야 합니다. 흔히 자금 공급이 원활히 이루어지지 않는 상황을 혈액순환과 빗대어서 돈맥교화라는 표현을 씁니다. 건강한 경제 생태의 구축을 위해서는 이 돈맥교화가 일어나지 않고 대기업은 물론이고 중소기업, 소상공인, 발명자, 연구자 개별 가게에 이르기까지 국가 경제라는 온몸 구석구석에 금융이라는 혈액이 효율적으로 공급되어야 합니다. 그러나 안타깝게도 기존의 금융에 있어서는 이 대기업과 중소기업 간의 양극화 현상이 두드러지게 나타나고 있습니다. 저는 지식재산 금융이야말로 금융의 양극화 현상을 극복하고 우리 경제의 말단까지 혈액을 원활하게 공급할 수 있는 혈액순환 치료제라는 생각을 가지고 있습니다. 그런데 이 지식재산 금융이라는 화두를 제기하기 위해서는 무엇보다도 지식재산이 실제하는 자산으로 인식되어야 한다는 전제가 필요합니다. 과거의 경제학에 있어서는 생산의 3대 요소는 토지와 자본 그리고 노동이었습니다. 그러나 앞서 언급한 바와 같이 오늘날의 글로벌 경영 환경 하에서는 지식재산은 기업의 핵심 역량이자 자산이라는 것이 자명한 사실입니다. 따라서 21세기 경제학의 생산 요소에는 지식이라는 요소가 새로이 추가되어 토지, 자본, 노동 그리고 지식의 4대 요소가 되어야 합니다. 이는 부가가치를 창출하는 구체적인 요소로서 지식재산이 기업의 자산으로 인식되어야 함을 의미합니다. 하지만 최근 지식재산이 기업의 중요한 자산이라는 사실에 대한 공감대가 널리 확산되었음에도 불구하고 금융시장에서는 여전히 금융의 대상으로서 지식재산의 가치를 충분히 인정하지 않는 보수적인 시각이 많은 실정입니다. 그러나 지식재산이 기업 가치에서 차지하는 비중이 상당하고 또 실제적인 가치를 지니고 있다는 것이 분명해졌습니다. 금융기관들은 지식재산을 기업의 자산 항목으로 인정하는 데 적극적인 자세로 전향해야만 할 것입니다. 그런데 이 지식재산이 자산 항목으로 인식되지 못하는 것은 단순히 금융기관들의 보수적인 태도 때문만이 아닙니다. 사실 모든 경제 주체들이 지식재산의 실제적 가치가 존재하고 있다는 것에 동의하고 있다 할지라도 객관적이고 구체적인 가치 산정이 힘들다면 실제 현장에서 의사결정을 내리기가 매우 힘들 것입니다. 이러한 상황에서 지식재산의 금융 활성화를 위해서는 어떤 방향으로 노력을 기울여야 할까요? 그것은 바로 지식재산 금융이 자생할 수 있는 생태계를 만들어야 한다고 생각합니다. 정권사에 소속된 많은 애널리스트들이 기업의 가치를 산정하기 위해 많은 노력을 쏟고 있으며 매일매일의 거래를 통해 더욱 정확하게 기업의 가치를 산정하려고 노력하고 있습니다. 투자은행들은 새로운 형태의 금융 상품들을 창조적으로 만들어내어 기업들의 자본을 조달하고 있으며 또 대출 시장에서는 차입자의 신용도를 확인하기 위해 많은 자금을 투입해 시스템을 운영하고 있습니다. 이렇듯 금융이라는 거대한 메커니즘은 금융 생태계에 속한 모든 경제 주체들의 자율적인 활동을 통해 유지되어 가고 있습니다. 지식재산 금융 생태계 역시 기존 금융 시스템과의 조화를 바탕으로 은행, 벤처캐피탈, 기술거래, 중개기관, 기업 등 관련 주체들의 자율과 창의에 기반하여 구축되어야 한다고 생각합니다. 저희 특허청을 비롯한 경제부처들 모두 이러한 사실에 대해 잘 인식하고 있으며 최대한 민간의 자율적 활동을 제한하지 않으면서 지식재산 금융 생태계 조성을 위한 기반 마련을 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 특허청은 지식재산 금융의 기반을 마련한다는 측면에서 여러 가지 정책들을 실행하고 있습니다. 지난해 저희 특허청은 현 정부의 새로운 경제 패러다임인 창조경제 구현을 하는 가장 효율적인 실천 전략으로서 각계각층의 의견과 현장 목소리를 들어서 이 지식재산 기반의 창조경제 실현 전략을 수립하였습니다. 또한 구체적인 후속 조치로서 지식재산 금융 활성화 정책을 수립하여 지식재산에 기반한 창업 및 사업화를 지원하고 관련 기반을 마련해 나가기 위해 노력하고 있습니다. 또한 특허청은 이 창의적인 아이디어를 사업하기 위해서는 금융과의 연계가 반드시 필요하다는 점을 인식하고 우수한 지식재산을 보유하고 있는 중소기업에 대한 금융 지원을 적극 유도해 왔습니다. 구체적으로 산업은행, 신용보증기금, 기술보증기금, 기업은행 등과의 협력을 통해서 지난해에 지식재산권을 매개로 212개 기업에 759억 원의 자금을 지원했습니다. 이는 2012년에 505억 원에 비한 50%나 증가한 수치입니다. 특히 지식재산 금융의 실질적 선진화를 위해서 그 기업 수에 맞는 다양한 형태의 지식재산 금융 상품을 통해 자금을 지원했습니다. 구체적으로 산업은행과 협력하여 지식재산 담보대출 협력 모델을 수립하고 물적 담보 없이 지식재산만을 담보로 15개 기업 169억 원의 대출을 연계하였으며 이와 동시에 지식재산 담보대출의 특성을 반영한 특허, 상표 분야 지식재산 가치평가 모델을 개발한 바 있습니다. 또한 2006년부터 기술보증기금과 추진해온 특허기술 가치평가 연계보증을 신용보증기금과도 협력해 시행함으로써 모두 109개 기업 410억 원의 보증을 연계했습니다. 이 외에도 투자연계 특허기술평가 및 투자유치 인큐베이션 프로그램을 통해서 중소기업들의 투자 자금을 지원했으며 모태펀드 특허 개정을 통해서 2013년 말까지 총 309개 기업에 5,078억 원을 투자했었습니다. 지금까지 특허 측에서 시행하고 있는 우수 지식재산 보유 중소기업에 대한 금융 지원이나 또 다른 금융기관들과의 협력, 지식재산의 특성을 반영한 가치평가 모델의 구축과 같은 정책들은 모두 지식재산 금융 생태계 구축을 위한 빌딩 블록이라고 할 수 있습니다. 특허청은 앞으로도 이 담보대출 협력 모델의 시중은행 확산, 지식재산 거래 활성화 등과 같이 다양한 형태의 빌딩 블록을 통해서 인간의 자율적인 역량을 바탕으로 선순환적인 지식재산 금융의 생태계가 구축될 수 있도록 지원을 확대해 나갈 계획입니다. 우리나라는 이제 경제 규모에서는 1인당 국민소득이 2만 불 이상이 되었고 세계 9번째로 무역 규모 1조 달러를 달성하였으며 특허 출원이 세계 4위에 이르는 등 경제와 지식재산권 양 분야 모두에서 양적으로 큰 성장을 이루었습니다. 이제는 산업 생산 부분만 아니라 금융 부분에서도 실물 경제에 걸맞게 세계적 수준의 선진화를 이루어야 할 때가 되었습니다. 지식재산 금융의 활성화를 통해 작게는 우리나라 금융산업의 혁신을 이루고 크게는 우리나라 경제 구조 전반의 선진화를 달성할 수 있을 것이라 기대합니다. 지식재산을 기반으로 하는 창조경제 달성을 위해 모두 정부와 민간이 각각 맡은 바 영역에서 최선을 다하며 같은 방향을 바라보고 또 한 걸음씩 나아갈 때 모든 국민이 행복한 희망의 새 시대가 열릴 것입니다. 이상으로 제 발표를 마치겠습니다. 경청해 주셔서 감사합니다.
네, 청장님 감사합니다. 창조경제 활성화를 위한 핵심 키워드죠. 지식재산 금융의 중요성을 쉽게 이해할 수 있었던 좋은 말씀 감사합니다. 무대 단상 정리가 마무리된 후 첫 번째 세션 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 그럼 지금부터 첫 번째 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 세션 1은 영국, 미국, 중국에서 초청한 지식재산 및 금융 전문가들을 모시고 IP금융 생태계 조성을 위한 각국의 경험을 공유하는 시간 갖도록 하겠습니다. 직전 안내를 통해 말씀드린 바와 같이 질문은 나눠드린 질문지를 통해 적어주시면 질의응답 시간에 제가 대신 질문해드리도록 하겠습니다. 발표는 각 20분씩 진행되며 첫 번째 발표는 영국 밸류에이션 컨설팅사의 디렉터이신 켈빈 킹님, 두 번째 발표는 미국 인텔렉츄얼 인벤션스사의 CTO이신 에드워드 정님, 마지막 발표는 중국 국가지식산권국 데퓨티 디렉터 제너럴이신 레이 샤오인님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. 그럼 먼저 지난 12월 영국 지식재산청에서 발표한 지식재산 금융 활성화를 위한 연구 보고서 뱅킹 온 IP의 공동 저자이자 영국 지식재산 그리고 무형자산 가치평가 분야의 전문가이신 켈빈 킹 이사님을 단상위로 모시겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. Please give him a big round of applause.
One of the reasons, I guess, is the authorship in the UK of this big report, Banking on Intellectual Property. Why that arose was as follows. The small to medium-sized enterprises in the UK had great difficulty in presenting a business plan and a business case because of the lack of understanding and the lack of due diligence for intellectual property and intangible assets when they were presenting to mainstream and core banking. Core banking and mainstream lending, remember, is not angel funding, is not crowdfunding, is not corporate venturing. It is the main banks in the UK who are responsible for most lending, HSBC, RBS, Barclays to a limited extent, and the new entrants like Silicon Valley Bank from the US are making a much better headway. But the banks really have trouble in understanding intellectual property and intangible assets as a class, and they speak a different language to the SMEs who are presenting to them. And that's why the UK Intellectual Property Office commissioned this report, which was purely a research document, which was purely there to see what was going on, how we could move to a better place, and as I would say, a dictionary and a book that both lending and SMEs could read together and understand together, so they were hitting together when they were speaking to each other in seeking finance and security. And these statistics are quite important. 30% more is spent on intangible assets in the UK than physical assets. And of course the banks are used to physical assets. They're used to real estate. They're used to plant and machinery. They understand how to put charges on these assets. And this is one of the key things which I'll identify a little bit later. And that statistic there, 4% of UK GDP, 59 billion, and 103 billion local Korea in 2013 was spent on assets and their protection with trademark and patent attorneys. So somebody thinks these assets are worthwhile protecting because these figures are very large. The big issue in all valuation is understanding that you can do it. And the mathematics and the economics are of course important. But you know what, in all my years, and I was pretty much responsible for setting up UK government's intellectual property division in March 1981, that long ago, when if you said trademark, patent, design right, copyright, this is 80% of corporate worth today, you'd have been locked up, you would have been put away, because all that could be seen in those days was the physical assets. But government here, and particularly government in the United States, were ahead of the game, because companies, and I was discussing this a little bit earlier, were moving these intellectual properties into Swiss mountains and onto Bermudan beaches. Why was that? Well, we see it as front page news today, don't we, with Amazon, Google and Facebook putting their intellectual property holding companies into these locations that are tax efficient. So that's why government were ahead of the game. And this is quite important. Government had a view of intellectual property, which was its view. And it thought these companies are potentially avoiding tax, local tax. So they had a view, but the companies had a different view. And it's just like a small to medium-sized company. It will have its view of its worth But it's difficult translating that if you're not a banker. When you're going to meet a banker, you've got to get into the mindset of that banker, of that lender, who's not used to taking this sort of risk with an asset that they can't touch and feel. So there's two perspectives of valuation, and you really need to begin to understand this. You've got to represent yourself to somebody else. So you've got to start thinking about where that person is coming from. And we'll develop that just a little bit later. I call it the prospectus of valuation. There's easily in this slide two prospectus of valuation: the bankers and the SMEs. However, there are two more, and I'll bring those out a little bit later, and they are very important to remember. We have a huge problem because of accounting. Accounting does not allow you to represent these assets in financial reporting. Unlike plant and machinery, unlike real estate, where you will see valuations in balance sheets, you cannot, to this day, go to your accountant and your auditor, even if you're Samsung, Coca-Cola, and say, I would like to see the value of my trademarks in my accounts. You still cannot do that today, which is tragic if you've built up these significant assets. As I say, 80% of corporate worth. However, we have a little bit of a movement in accounting. We have international financial standards, and we have International Financial Standard 3. It's all about mergers and acquisitions. It's all about purchase price allocation on an acquisition. So you can now begin to show intellectual property that has been acquired. So if you acquire a company for 100, it's no longer 100 of goodwill. You need to identify within these categories on this slide what you have acquired. Now this is a fantastic list. I thought we were just going to get patents, trademarks, design rights and copyright, the great tenets of IP protection, where patent and trademark attorneys make good fees and companies spend a lot of money quite properly protecting these assets, those key asset classes. But have a look at this. This is a very detailed summary of a number of assets and can be used by an SME, a small company, as a checklist. Do I have these assets? Should I protect them? But the key thing here is this list was developed by the regulators and the accounting bodies with this premise, with this basis. We can identify these assets clearly. We can do the due diligence. And remember, over 50% of my valuation work of intellectual property is due diligence. It's not just mathematics. It's not just economic modelling. It's due diligence, working as a team with the lawyers, the trademark and patent attorneys to understand the asset. But what the regulator said here, we can identify these assets and we are happy that skilled valuers can produce valuation methodologies that are acceptable to us. Well, let me tell you, I've been valuing intellectual property since, as I said, the early 1980s. This is not new. This is not a group of people with magic wands and crooked hats, the people that value intellectual property. A number of us worldwide have been doing it for a long period of time. And what have we been doing it for? Well, maybe not lending so much, although that will come. We've been doing it for tax reasons. I do a lot of expert witness work in court on patents and trademark infringement issues. Courts have examined my valuation processes, my methodologies, as have tax authorities. We've been looking at valuation methodologies for a long time, so don't tell me they're new and strange. We've just got to get the bankers on our side to show, like we've shown governments and tax authorities and the court processes worldwide in litigation, that those processes that have been examined very significantly are just as good for you bankers and just as good as lending on real estate and any other assets. Look, worldwide, and particularly in Southeast Asia and Korea, it's a fantastic job of intervention with intellectual property. You know, as we've got this new knowledge awareness, we've really seen good interventions in your country and many others in Southeast Asia. and of course in the US, which has led the way a long time in lending. We in the middle in Europe, we have been a bit slow. We've been a bit sluggish, as we would say. And we're seeing a fantastic, support which has been, summarised already, so I won't go through it again, in Korea, of intervention supporting your small to medium-sized enterprises. But I also understand there's initiatives that have taken place here which encourages big corporates to support the small guys as well. This is fantastic stuff. We haven't got there yet in England and in the UK, and Europe is even longer and further way behind. So well done, and thank you, all of you in Southeast Asia and here in Korea for really leading the way in these interventions. It's fantastic, and I covered a number of them in Korea and in other parts of Southeast Asia in my report, because it's a really good thing to see. Because do you know what? A number of times people say to me, well, we can't see transactions, we can't see this, we can't see that. Well, that's because bankers and lenders don't look hard enough. We can see a lot of trading, a lot in the markets, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But, as I said here, big banking is still resistant to debt financing. Big banking, at least in the UK, is still responsible for most lending. Most lending. Angel lending, corporate venturing, venture capital is still a small proportion. We've got to get big banks on side. I was with the head of Barclays Investment Bank only last week in the UK. It's also responsible for Southeast Asia. And they've got a lot of money. They've got a lot of money that's just sitting there. We've got to free up that space and to make us all a better place. But look at that last bullet point. Intellectual property is not just life science, bio, pharma. Hey, it's in traditional industry, and it always has been, in engineering, in manufacturing, in retail. Intellectual property has been around for a long time. It's just getting it into your heads that it is intellectual property, and the accountants need to get up to speed. Luckily, Sir David Tweedy and the International Valuation Standards Council are really doing a good job, and it's worthwhile keeping an eye on their website. There's good developments in this area. We're getting there, but it's slow, and Southeast Asia and you in Korea are leading the way, and we can all hopefully take a leaf, as we say, out of your book. Here are some identified areas in my report. Cash flow, as we know, is key to debt finance. But where is that cash flow coming from? Banking and lending fails to ask this question. What are the assets driving the cash flow? How are they protected? What kind of risk do they suffer? We're not asking enough of those questions. It's cash flow, but we need to identify that cash flow in its intellectual property sense, not it's just cash flow, not it's just mathematics. We need to do the due diligence on it in a much better way. And that involves intellectual property and intangibles being identified. So we need you, we need IP people, IP lawyers, IP attorneys to help the process of identification, to show banking that these are real assets, that many, many companies spend millions and millions of pounds protecting these assets, so that must mean something. But we've got to get this into the banker's mind. It's a little bit about, the finance director in many of your companies. He looks over to the trademark and patent attorney team, and he looks at that team as cost. It's just cost, cost, cost. The finance director team, and this is a human dimension element, doesn't realise that that team is probably the most key team in the business, the one that protects. Yes, it spends a lot, but it's the one that protects those assets and ring-fences them. I think I heard the other day that Samsung is one of the largest filers in Europe. Fantastic stuff, but let's get the finance team talking and appreciating the patent and IP professionals and trademark professionals in a little better way than viewing them purely as a cost centre. More effective charges should be part of the lending package, I say there. When I wrote my report, I was amazed how interesting the answers were when I said, what kind of charges do you put on intellectual property? You know, in real estate lending, we have easy schedules at the land registry, for example, where you can register a charge, a mortgage, or whatever. And you know what? You can do that in the UK at the Intellectual Property Office with trademarks and patents. But an awful lot of the bankers that I interviewed for my report didn't even know that registration process existed. They didn't even understand how to fix a charge. They rely on floating charges. And of course, if you rely on floating charges, what's going to happen if your company is getting into distress? Well, I can tell you what, it's no floating charge because those assets with the directors are going to float away before that company gets into distress. Floating charges are useless. You can secure fixed charges on intellectual property very successfully, but it's still not standard practice. It's incredible, absolutely incredible how naive banking is, at least in the UK and Europe generally, in not securing directly on these assets. Affordable risk mitigation strategies are to be encouraged. Look, that's not the valuer. Again, it's IP legal, it's IP trademark and patent attorney work. It's you guys stepping up to the plate and being more positive perhaps in representing yourselves at board level and being part of that significant fiduciary piece at board level and accountable because of it. Yes, an IP demands joined up thinking. It's finance, it's law, it's economics, it's valuation. It's a number of different areas you draw together to make that IP a credible case. And I've interestingly, excited your interest a little bit earlier, hopefully, to suggest to you that valuation is not just mathematics, it's just not economics. That's the last bit of my work. When I'm doing valuation or royalty rate advice, 50% plus of my time and my work is working with the scientists, working with the technologists, working with the trademark and patent attorneys to build up my understanding of the risk of an asset. Yes, quantitative analysis, as I've said there, is important, but it really is a relative subject. People say it is an art and not a science, and there's a lot to that. And all valuation, of course, is wrong, particularly with the benefit of hindsight, but you do the best you can. And indeed, valuation is demanded in certain situations. It's demanded for accounting, it's demanded for tax reasons, it's demanded for litigation, although somebody may disagree with you. This is a process which has been subject to scrutiny. And it's actually quite a subjective process. It is not just figures, because you would soon get yourself very badly wrong if it was. It's a lot of due diligence. I know there's a session later today on valuation, but I just want to pick up a few bits on what is valuation from my perspective. You've got to think about why you're doing it, and there are many reasons: mergers, acquisitions, joint venturing. I'm doing something for the Chinese government at the moment, and they're looking at an acquisition. That's an entirely different process to doing a valuation for litigation or a valuation for lending. Valuation for lending, do you know what that is? Those bankers, they don't want to know what a going concern valuation is. The only thing that the bankers and lenders are interested in, what happens when this asset goes into distress, Kelvin? I want you to value this brand or these patents or this copyright on the basis that it is in distress. So it's not a going concern valuation, it's quite rightly, what could we sell this asset for when we need our money back, if we need our money back. That's a fair way of modelling, and it's a fair request. So the occasions for valuation, why is the valuation required, leads to a different figure. Not all figures are the same. It depends on the reason. And yet, if I'm advising an acquisition or I'm doing a defensive valuation, I go high or I go low. But of course, there is a boundary with all valuation. It's 8, it's 10, it's 12. but it isn't 15 and it's not 5. Okay? There's always a range, there's never a spot. Methods, how much, how long, and at what risk. That's what you're doing, and that's no different to how you value real estate or plant and machinery. But let's just finalise this little session here. Valuation perspectives. Look, we got the banker there, and we got the SME here. The SME, if he employs a valuer to present his business case, will present a good business case on a highest defendable basis. But we want to get into the mind of the banker. How does he want this valuation presented? What's his attitude? And that's not the SME's attitude. You've got to think about how you present it to the person that you're trying to convince. And he will have different views. He will have a different attitude to risk. He'll be different to you anyway. All of you in this room are different to each other. And that banker, he will be saying, what does Kelvin think he's worth? And what does he think he's worth to me on the lending scale? And if you don't get into that mindset, you're going to fail. You're going to fail with your presentation to your lending environment. And I don't know about you, and I'll finish on this before the Q&A. And it's not too different in lending or presenting yourself as an SME. If I need to negotiate with my wife on holidays or the children, I will maybe go down to my bar and I'll have a drink with my friends. And I will say, Nigel, Martin, I've got to negotiate with Jill tonight about going on a holiday. And I want to go to Barbados. Jill wants to go to Switzerland. I want to win this argument. I do not want to go to Switzerland. I want to enjoy the sun in Barbados. And I will get all the advice from my friends. And after a few pints of Guinness, I like a Guinness, I will feel very confident. I will feel very confident that I'm going to win my argument. And I will go home very confident. Within about 30 seconds, Jill will throw a ball, hit me on the back of the head. Hey, I didn't know where she was going to come from on that one, and nor did my friends, because she's a girl and I'm a boy. But hey, do you know what I did in this process? I gave Jill the respect. Yes, I wanted to win the argument, but I tried to think about where she was going to come from. And that's what, as an SME, you've got to do when you're going into that banker. You've got to get into his mind. You might not get it right. You might not. You're not a lender yourself. You're an SME. But you want to think about where they come from. And if you do that, it will be a better place for you. So thank you very much. And we'll just have a bit of Q&A. If there is any.
Thank you for your presentation. 켈빈 킹 이사님께서 기업금융 초진에 있어서 지식재산 역할에 대해 연구 경험담을 소개해 주셨습니다. 좋은 발표 감사드립니다. 바로 이어서 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 각 발표가 끝나고 작성해 주신 소중한 질문들을 제가 대신 질문해 드리겠습니다. 시간 관계상 모든 질문을 답변해 드리지 못하는 점 양해 부탁드립니다. 지금 마무리가 되었고요. 두 번째 발표부터는 발표를 들으시다가 세션이 끝나기 전까지 직원에게 질문지를 전달해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. Director Kelvin King, I will ask a few questions, the participants' questions during the presentation. If I read each question in Korean and in English, and then using simultaneous interpretation, please answer in English. First question is, what is the advantage and disadvantage of venture capitals and banks which provide money to patent fees?
What is the advantage? Well, the advantage is this, that they will actually lend. Banks are in the business of making money. And nowadays, I mentioned, I was with Barclays in the UK last week, they've got a lot of money, but they've got to be encouraged to actually use that money and to make profits. If you don't, the core business of banking, or what it used to be, was lending and making a good profit because of that commercial activity. And if they don't do that, they're really going to slide backwards. And that's the important bit. There isn't any other asset class left other than the patents or the trademarks or whatever it is. So to make business and to be commercial and to take a little bit of a risk, you don't have to take much, because I can do distress valuations. It encourages the banks to make better profits, and that's what's available today.
Thank you. The second question, this time I will ask question in Korean, using simultaneous interpretation, please. 천천히 질문하도록 하겠습니다. 국제회계 기준에서 지식재산은 공정가치 산정 후 계상이 가능하지만 여전히 실무에서 독립자산으로서의 인식은 제한적인 것으로 알고 있습니다. 한국에서 지식재산을 재무제표에서 가치화하기 위해서는 어떠한 노력이 필요할까요?
Well, what we need to do is to encourage what Sir David Tweedy and the International Valuation Standards Committee and Council are doing, is to convince accounting, convince the regulators that these assets have been valued consistently and been valued well for a number of years. And I will give you an example of this. When I was talking to the Prudential Regulation Authority in the UK, that used to be, the finance regulator, it's now the PRA, and they said, well, Kelvin, we can hear what you say when we're calculating our ratios, but really with intellectual property we do not see a market. Well, there is a market, and there's been a market for a long time. Let's just make it easy. It's not life sciences or bio necessarily. What about hotels? Some of the largest intellectual property issues are within franchising, the Hiltons of this world, the International Hotels Group. Hey, this is intellectual property within a fixed asset environment. And what about plant and machinery that's just got process patents making it work? And what about a big printing machine that just works on knowledge and know-how and software? It would be junk without it. We need to convince people that these assets have been traded and have been traded a long time. They just haven't been so visible. They've been within fixed asset environments. And that, if you start from there, it'll start to get those bankers a little bit more comfy. Hey, we have been lending in franchising. We have been lending to McDonald's. Hey, we have been lending to Kentucky Fried Chicken. And hey, we haven't had distress. Well, that's all intellectual property lending in my book. And if we can convince those bankers and lenders to think of it like that actually they haven't had distressed lending with intellectual property, and perhaps we'll give pharma a go, perhaps we'll give life sciences, the more media and creative industries a chance as well, then we'll be a better place.
Thank you. 시간 관계상 이 질문을 마지막으로 해야 할 것 같습니다. 세 번째 질문은 한국어로 질문드리겠습니다. 최근 영국 지식재산청에서 IP금융 관련 보고서를 발간했죠. 영국 정부의 보고서가 가지는 의미에 대해서 답변 부탁드리고요. 그리고 현재 영국에서 그 보고서 활용에 대해서도 답변 부탁드립니다.
It's a very good question. The main recommendation was a resource and toolkit. I was speaking a little bit earlier about creating this book that both the banker and the lender and the small to medium-sized owner could study and read together. It would be the same book in the same language, so they could just talk to each other. We need this toolkit, we need this resource, which is not just from the valuer, but it's from the IP professional. We all need to work together and with the finance people to get this book, the encyclopedia, the dictionary, it doesn't matter what it's called. We need that to happen. At the moment, it is not happening. I hope it will happen in the near future, but the Intellectual Property Office in the UK has commissioned further study to try and understand the transparency of the market, to try and illustrate licensing and intellectual property transactions, because they see this as the key to showing bankers that that intellectual property is a tradable commodity, although it's not so clear as real estate and plant and machinery, where auctions, for example, and sales are quite prevalent worldwide. So that's what's happening at the moment, and I desperately hope by the end of this year we're going to be progressing the resource toolkit, which is just the book that everybody understands.
Thank you very much. 이상으로 질의응답을 마치도록 하겠습니다. This concludes the Q&A session. 켈빈 킹 이사님께 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. Let's give it a big round of applause.
Thank you very much. I like to walk around, so I'm going to stay away from the lectern. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm going to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, which is building an invention capital market. The way I look at this is a little bit different than some of the other speakers, because my company participates from a very, very early stage of intellectual property all the way to the late stage. So as some background of why this is an interesting place to be, although you may know a lot of this already, the intellectual property market has grown tremendously over the last 10 to 15 years, both in all terms, in terms of the supply, in terms of global patent growth, in terms of the demand, here represented by the prizes offered for intellectual property, in terms of the value as measured by disputes and the number of counterparties in these disputes, and the value as actually Mr. King had talked about, in the percentage of value that's attributed to intangible assets, which nowadays is considered the vast majority of the value inside of S&P 500 companies in the United States. On top of this, we're seeing a great globalization of ideas. This is about scientific research papers, and how, although the U.S. continues to have a large share of those research papers, there is an increasing amount that's coming from overseas. And maybe, even more importantly, an increasing amount that represents collaborations that are happening between countries. And this is something that's very important to me, and should be important to you also, which is you need to be a global player, because the ideas are coming from all over the world. Here is an article about startups and the value of intellectual property to startups. This is in two categories. The startups that have filed for intellectual property in the form of patents in the 5 years before they were funded, and on the right-hand side, for 5 years before they're funded and 5 years after they're funded. And by every metric that has been measured here, from the number of rounds of financing they get to the amount of time that the investors give these companies, the companies that file for intellectual property and have patent assets have a better deal from investors, venture capital investors, than ones who do not. Their total investment is about 50% higher. Their failure rate is about a third of those who do not have IP. And their rate of success in terms of going public is almost 5 times higher. So it's quite a big difference. Intellectual property has a high value for these startups. And if you look across different countries, you will see that young countries who don't have a lot of incumbent companies have a higher fraction of their IP coming from startups. And it is the mature countries that can keep that fraction high that have some of the best startup stories in the world. So I think this is an important metric to look at. If you look at what happens when these startups grow up, in terms of profitability per employee, so it's a term of kind of efficiency of these companies to generate profits for their shareholders and for their home economies, the average of the global 500 companies in the world is far less than the top companies in the world. And all of those top companies, whether they are in IT or in materials or pharmaceuticals, are very invention-driven, IP-heavy companies. So I think it's another lesson to look at, that you get profitability from intellectual property. And this is reflected by CEOs around the world. PwC's latest CEO survey showed that CEOs around the world recognize this huge value of intellectual property and continue to want to reorganize their companies around increasing the efficiency of innovation, increasing their intellectual property and intangible assets, and even up to and including changing the way they do business in order to increase the amount of innovation happening in their companies. I think all of these slides is about trying to explain that IP, intellectual property and invention, is the knowledge economy's most valuable asset. It has been difficult and challenging to value in a precise way, but its value is clearly increasing and very large. If you look at the story of the United States had a very unprecedented position over the last 100 plus years as being the most successful invention economy in the world. As a consequence, it created the lion's share of new businesses ranging from automotive to pharmaceutical and so on that were either started in the United States or co-founded in the United States. And there really never has been a period of history where it has been dominated so much, innovation has been dominated so much by one country. So it's interesting to look at the country, particularly because the U.S. is not going to continue to dominate going into the future, but to see what the United States has learned. The U.S. is very reliant on intellectual property and invention for its economy. More than 50% of the total IP revenues in the world flow into the U.S., but importantly, almost two-thirds of its exports rely on IP-intensive industries. If you look at the United States in 1820, before it became an invention powerhouse, its share of the GDP of the world was actually a little less than Korea's share today. But by 2010, it had gone up by almost a factor of 15, and commensurately, you could look at both the GDP per capita and the patents granted as one of the drivers of this kind of growth. It was a deliberate government policy to try to, starting around 1820 to 1840, to increase the invention rate of the United States in order to increase the productivity of new industry. And this is something that caused a great explosion in wealth. U.S. universities still have the highest research impact, but if you look at this over time, it's changing quite dramatically, and its dominance is decreasing. But today, 40 of the top 50 universities with the highest research impact are still in the United States. Again, this is changing slowly, but it's important to realize that the investment in the early stage of research and development is what also creates this later stage value to be produced. So university investment is important. And of course, as you all know, there's been many different kinds of IP financing in the United States. Many times it starts in the US because they're very open-minded about these new financing mechanisms. But you've seen everything from IP-backed securities to public auctions and equity financing, all IP-backed, starting from the US. I think it's interesting to see that most of the areas where there's been a lot of valuation work has been done are usually in later stage IP assets. IP assets that are either producing cash or can be attached to some kind of cash flow, as Mr. King was talking about. And it's interesting to think about how to bring that earlier, particularly in an economy of great growth like Korea, and figure out how early assets can also be backed so they can be converted into very profitable new kinds of companies. So how do you build an IP ecosystem? For over the last, I guess about 13 years, my company, Intellectual Ventures, has been trying to figure out how to build an ecosystem of IP. Now, I don't know if we have the right answer, but I think I can describe at least the one we came up with. First of all, it's about trying to bring lots of different parties together into a system where they have different incentives to participate over a long time horizon. And this ranges from different kinds of investors. Some are yield investors, like banks. And we've done several deals with banks for IP financing recently because we have mature assets that they can value. We've worked with very, very prestigious valuation companies in order to try to figure out how we can create a scalable model of valuation, but we're not there yet. We've also worked with very speculative investors like venture capitalists and some of the LPs that actually back things like venture capital. In total, we've worked with more than $7 billion of capital in our ecosystem, trying to find different ways of deploying it both in the short term and the long term. We've also worked with a lot of inventors who, whether they're in laboratories, research facilities like universities, or are individuals. We worked with over 5,000 inventors around the world and over 500 different universities and research institutions, again, around the world, to try to figure out how to incentivize them to get their ideas out early. Some universities, like Stanford or MIT, are very lucky because they get a lot of financing for their ideas because they're in the right location. But other universities, including ones in Asia, some in India, some even in places like New Hampshire in the United States, don't get access to that kind of financing. And that's something we've been able to help with. Of course, at the other end, people who need the IP, whether they're MNCs, very large companies, or very small companies, we work with them on new programs too, and I want to describe some of them. In all, we've tried to build a very big global system. We have more than 700 people in the company, over 2,000 contractors, over 5,000 inventors. And this is all $7 billion deployed without any leverage. We currently generate a very good cash yield, so it's a very interesting kind of long-term investment, and shows that if you invest with diversity and with scale, you can actually generate a return from something pretty speculative. Some of the spin-outs we've done, TerraPower, which is a new kind of nuclear reactor, shows that we can invest in the long term, something that's become very difficult in places like the US, where companies have been starting to think shorter term and even venture capitalists think shorter term. TerraPower is a 40-year investment for new nuclear power, and it's one that we've been able to do with our model very efficiently. Chimera, new kind of antenna company, Global Good, which is a non-profit that works on developing world inventions, where we've deployed things like vaccine, refrigerators, and new ways of doing agriculture. I think the key part of what we're doing is looking how to finance over the long term. Now, there's a lot of people who will sit at the short term here at the very end when an invention has become productive or has become part of the economy in that a lot of people are using it. At that point, you can value it based on things like the potential litigation outcomes. You can value it on the basis of cash flows generated from licensing or cross-licensing. And that's an area where you can get a lot of scale. But if you bring it all the way down to the very beginning of invention capital, when someone just has ideas, or a set of universities are working on very new technologies, I think our job is to try to connect it all together so that you get both growth at the bottom end with high risk, and low risk, but a lot of deployment at the top end. That's going to cause at the top end a lot of employment growth, and at the bottom end a lot of innovation growth. And those two things are important to connect with all the different stages that exist, and we try to work at all of those stages. One of the things we can do this way is we can collect a tremendous amount of data on thousands of transactions that go across this, which my company has, and try to build better and better valuation models over time. I'm going to give a couple examples of things that we've done at the area of what I would say is harder to value and with SMEs. And this is an area that I'm very, very interested in bringing to Korea to try to become more successful here in this country in finding companies like these. So Raisio is a company in Finland. It's not a small company. It's actually public on the Finnish stock exchange. And it produces a bunch of consumer products that you eat and drink, but also cattle feed. It not just feeds people, it feeds animals. And they came up with a very interesting new kind of cattle feed that allows the milk from cows, which is the primary source of protein in a lot of countries. Milk from cows become more efficient, cleaner. The cow gets happier, has one more calf per breeding cycle, and emits less methane. So it reduces the greenhouse gas emission from a cow. So it's pretty amazing. And they called us, and we worked with them, to try to partner to create an ability for this company to go totally global. Because their invention is so valuable from every place like Ethiopia, China, Australia, a place like New Zealand. It's very valuable all over the world, but they're kind of stuck in Finland, trying to figure out, how can we make money off of this thing? Now, valuation experts for this public company had valued this invention at a small amount because they thought it's only useful to Finland. We got together with them, created a joint venture. We brought inventors from many different countries, from all over the world, to Finland to invent with their staff, to amplify their inventions and create global coverage. We went from 3 inventions to 92 inventions. We started marketing them globally, and now the joint venture is actually valued at over 400 million euro. So the valuation went up quite a bit by being able to give it a global footprint. So that's a lot of value added for this company, and we hope a lot of licensing value that will be generated from everywhere from Ethiopia, where it's a very poor country and they need to feed their people, to very rich countries like Australia and New Zealand in terms of dairy. Raizu maintains their licensing rights in Finland. We provide the global licensing in the joint venture, and the Inventor Network continues to add value to it over time. And they're very happy about it, obviously, because the valuation is so high. We have a lot of other deals like this. Nest, which is a company that does kind of smart thermostats, was bought by Google for several $1 billion. They were locked up in kind of a IP litigation with another company, and we were able to help them out by giving them IP with which they could negotiate with this other company. Here's a couple of other examples of small-sized companies which we've helped in various different ways, by either helping them with their IP, injecting new IP in them, or helping them market themselves globally. And these are all things that I think are going to be really interesting to do here in Korea as well. Several weeks ago, I guess about a month ago, I was at Beijing, and we did a Food and Health Innovation Summit in conjunction with 2 Chinese ministries. We did our 4 Platinum Inventor Awards, or Worldwide Inventor Awards. We brought 9 different companies from outside of China into China to work on trying to improve their IP value by hooking them up with deals inside of China. And we were able to have both the Green Food Association and the Chinese Association of Inventors bring people together to kind of connect up into this ecosystem of invention. I think they were very, very happy with the results and invited us to come many times a year. I don't know how often I'll actually go to their farms, because then you have to fill out an extra form on the immigration. But anyway, I think they're very happy with the result. And this is the kind of value, again, we try to bring both the big companies and small companies. So in Korea, we're actively pursuing opportunities like this. I really would like any of your help in suggesting people we should talk to. We want to collaborate with innovative Korean companies, particularly ones that are hungry for global expansion. I'd like to get to my team goal to get to an MOU by the end of this year, and hopefully 2 more in 2015 that will start to prove out the value we can bring to SMEs here in Korea. Of course, we continue to talk to large companies here also about both licensing IP efficiently and supplying them with new IP and new products that can come from all over the world. But I think all of these kinds of transactions with which we are continue to try to work on figuring out how to value them efficiently are all things that we will use as benchmarks to figure out how to actually create more efficient financing mechanisms here in Korea as well. And so I thank you very much for inviting me here. I really look forward to working more both with government and private sector and finance here in Korea as you lead your way into this new IP economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 네, 에드워드 정 CTO께서는 지식재산 금융 생태계의 중심이죠. 미국 민간 토장 시장 현황에 대한 경험담을 소개해 주셨습니다. 좋은 발표 감사드립니다. 이전과 마찬가지로 바로 이어서 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. As before, I will ask a few questions. Please answer in English. 그럼 첫 번째 질문 드리겠습니다. 천천히 질문하겠습니다. 미국 금융기관, 특히 은행에서는 지적재산, IP 대출을 위한 인프라, 인력 조직을 갖추고 있는지 상세한 답변 부탁드리겠습니다.
Well, I think the banks definitely have infrastructure to provide loans. The difference between a loan and an IP-based loan is exactly what Mr. King was talking about. It's a matter of diligence. And banks often outsource their diligence anyway, and there is a number of companies that have emerged that are willing to provide counsel for that diligence. I will have to say, though, and I think this echoes what Mr. King was saying, is that the models for evaluation are not yet to the point where banks feel highly confident to deploy a lot of money through that system. And this may be an area where I'd love to cooperate here in Korea because it's been one of the most open countries in trying to develop this area, this market, to try to figure out if we can come up with better models. I have a research and development group that's been working for 7 years on models of valuation. We have a fair amount of data, and this might be a good place to cooperate to see how we can build a roadmap of reducing risk over time for these financial institutions to participate. And that will give the managers of these financial institutions and banks also a roadmap to understand how they can gradually step into the risk they need to take to finance this interesting asset class.
Thank you very much. 두 번째 질문 드리겠습니다. 인텔렉츄얼 벤처스를 포함한 NPE를 두고 기업을 사냥하는 특허 괴물이다. 그리고 반대로 발명을 장려하는 엔젤 투자다라는 상반된 시각이 존재하고 있는데요. 이런 평가에 대해서는 어떻게 생각하시는지 답변 부탁드립니다.
Well, I think they're not necessarily opposing views. You know, if I was an investor in real estate or I was an investor in public equities, if somebody were to steal my real estate, I would sue them. Or if somebody would sit in my apartments and not pay me any rent, I would sue them too. So it's mostly about protecting your asset. You wish, and I wish too, that you wouldn't have to do it very much. That people would comply, and there's no reason to take them to court because frankly, although I do employ a lot of lawyers, I don't really want to pay them so much money. I would much prefer to pay the companies or pay the inventors. That's much more efficient. And so if we can get to an efficient market where there's less litigation, because there's better transparency in valuation, and because there's better transparency in the inventions that are coming through, that'd be a much better world for all of us. But today, if you have IP, and let's say I have an invention from an inventor, and there are 3 companies that license it and pay money for it, and then there are 3 companies who do not, well, you kind of have to sue the 3 companies who decided to steal rather than to license. So it's an unfortunate side effect of the business that people don't understand value well enough to decide that it's worth paying for, or that disputes have to be arranged by courts as opposed to any kind of mediation or negotiation. But I'm very confident over time that we'll get better. We're already seeing that in many markets it's getting better as more companies and more inventors realize that they have to come to a common understanding of value in order for transactions to occur.
Thank you. 세 번째 질문 드리겠습니다. 발명가 금융기관, 제조회사, 국가기관을 연결하는 일을 한다고 했는데요. 첫 번째, 무엇을 어떻게 상호 연결할 것인지 사례를 들어 설명해 주시기 바랍니다. 그리고 두 번째로, 이러한 각 기관 간의 상호 연결에 대한 미래는 어떤 모습으로 발전할 수 있을지 설명 부탁드립니다.
It's a great question. I think there's 2 kinds of different linkages we make. One actually has to do with timing of value. So when you're an inventor or a research institution, and you come up with an invention that could be great, the problem is you may not know for another 10 years. And that's 10 years is a long time to wait to see if something is valuable. So we can actually come up with an incentive system that pays them early and gives them a profit sharing of something that gets produced in the long run. And that's a good incentive for an early stage inventor to get involved, right? But a corporation who might be interested in that invention doesn't want to pay early. Okay, they want to pay after their product is out or when they know the product is going to come out. They're much more risk averse. So in other words, one of the things we can do with our system is we can bridge the risk. We can say early people who are willing to take risk and maybe get less money. We can get them money earlier and give them profit sharing down the end. So they're taking risk on their invention. And customers who don't want to take risk and want to wait until everything is proven, well, they can wait later. Of course, they'll probably have to pay more, but again, they're taking less risk. And bridging that is part of the system that we build. The second thing is we're bridging different kinds of incentive. So a government, as an example, and many times a researcher, they're not really in it for money. They're in it for example, social value. We work with the Gates Foundation, which is only in it for social value. And we can bridge social value with things like other kinds of value, some of it is dollar denominated, some of it's risk denominated. And we can build incentive systems differently for all those different participants. So for example, with some governments, you come up with models that say for entire sectors of SME, we can get them all licensed together, and we can build a model where we make money if the SME becomes a big company, right? And that's a great social value for the government because that is reflected in employment and GDP increase. That's something we can work on. We can work, in some cases, we work with cities where they're trying to figure out how to save their small retail sector. That's a social value because they don't want all these small businesses dying, and we can try to deploy inventions along the KPI, the performance indicator, of saving those small retail industries, but at the same time give investors some kind of economic return, or again, give scientists some kind of ability to see their IP deployed over time. So I think the two kinds of things we try to balance, one is the kind of risk view of capital, and the second one is the nature of the kind of return you're getting, which sometimes is not financial.
Thank you. This concludes Q&A session. 이상으로 질의응답을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 에드워드 접시 지역에 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 마지막으로 중국 국가지식산권국 특허관리사 레이 샤오인 정책관님을 단상위로 모시겠습니다. 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. Please give her a big round of applause.
各位代表上午好，非常高兴有今天这个机会来参加这次论坛，与在座的各位讨论和交流关于知识产权金融服务方面的理论与实践问题。那我的发言题目呢是中国政府在知识产权金融服务方面的推进政策。我的发言分4个部分。那一呢是对知识产权金融服务的基本认识。那第二呢是我国在知识产权金融服务方面的工作情况。第三呢是我们当前面临的主要问题。第四是下一步的重点工作措施。那首先，关于对知识产权金融服务工作的基本认识，我想从3个角度跟大家分享3个观点。那3个角度是什么呢？是首先是从经济的驱动力，那么从经济的发展、产业的升级来看，知识产权已经成为经济发展的一个新的驱动力，而知识产权金融服务作为知识产权驱动力的重要的组成部分，那么需要大力的加强。那第二是从创新驱动的角度看知识产权制度，那么对于创新驱动是经过世界经济发展史的证明，知识产权制度是一个市场化的创新驱动的制度。那么在这个制度当中，知识产权要实现它的价值，金融服务不可或缺。从这个角度，我们也必须加强知识产权的金融服务。第三呢，是从现代服务业的发展，知识产权服务业的发展。那么知识产权金融服务作为服务业的一个现代金融服务业的一个重要的组成部分，那么会给我们提供更加多元化的一个服务，会给我们经济的增长带来更加多的贡献。那么从这3个角度来看，那么第一个角度，这里有一个数据，标准普尔500家上市公司的市值测算，那么已经知识产权在市值当中的占比从1975年的17%到2010年已经上升到81%啊。那么在这个过程里，知识产权已经成为重要的战略资源。那么我们说它是当前经济重要的驱动力，不可或缺。那么它事关我们经济未来的一个发展。那么第二，作为创新驱动的政策，那么刚才都提到知识产权数量这些年大幅度的增长，包括中国 那么去年专利申请量受理的专利申请量已经达到237.7万件，其中发明专利82.5万件。在大量的这个创新成果当中，创新成果要变现，知识产权金融服务是一个重要的组成部分。而创新驱动的这样一个机制的完成，一个可持续的发展，必须通过知识产权的价值实现来完成。没有价值实现，这个创新驱动的链就不完整，就不可能实现自身的一个市场化的运营机制。那么从这个角度看，我们能得到一个观点，就是知识产权的金融服务，我们也应该就是通过政府的推动来建立一个市场化的运作体系，跟知识产权制度是同样的，它应该建立一个市场化的运行体系。那么第三，从服务业的发展来看，那么知识产权服务业、金融服务业主要是围绕着对知识产权这种无形资产的运用、创造、运用、保护、管理，在这个全过程对它提供，例如许可、转让、质押、出资、风险投资、证券化以及价值分析和评估等全流程的服务。它的专业性非常强，它的系统性也非常强。正如上一个代表讲到，就是我们关注的不仅仅是它价值的评估，而是要从它的创新，是从它创新的原点就开始关注，那么这个创新生态才能完成，这个知识产权的一个生态系统才有可能完成。那么我们知识产权服务应该是一个全链条的服务，是一个系统化的服务。那么这是我们三个关于知识产权金融服务的基本观点。那么从这三个角度，我们认识到它对未来的现在和未来的一个发展，它是一个重要的驱动力。我们认识到它是创新驱动、可持续发展的一个重要的一个环节、一个组成部分，同时也是未来现代服务业的一个重要的组成部分，而且是专业化的一个组成部分。那么大家刚才都讲到知识产权生态，事实上知识产权生态事关到创新的生态。那么知识产权是连接创新和市场的桥梁。那么知识产权金融服务，那么通过知识产权的金融服务，使知识产权实现这个桥梁的作用，最后完成创新生态的循环，那么推动社会走向一个创新驱动的发展，实现这个创新对人类发展的一个不竭的推动力。那么基于这三个基本的观点，中国政府做了哪些工作？那么各国政府都在积极的推进，就诸如我们今天主办的这个论坛一样。那么中国政府呢，采取了很多的措施，那么通过呢有为的政府去构建一个有效的市场。那么重点呢有4个方面的措施。那一是在政策体系的构建，加强政策体系的建设。第二是开展具体的选择重点的条件基础好的区域，开展试点工作，探索模式。第三个是 CIPO 国家知识产权局直接和银行和保险公司建立合作机制，那么提升系统化的服务水平。那么第4呢是面向中小企业的需求，来培育知识产权服务机制的一个建设体系。那么首先在政策方面，那么在构建政策体系方面，从08年到现在，那出台了多项政策。那么那么地方还有很多政策，在这儿就不一一例举。在中央层面，在国家层面，由国家知识产权局联合相关的部委，那么还有就是国家知识产权局单独出台的就有以下的关于加强知识产权资产评估，那么还有呢支持中小企业的发展等等吧。我这列举的是几个重要的政策。那么其中大家比较关注的关于加强知识产权质押、融资与评估管理，是2010年由财政部、银监会、国家知识产权局等多个部委 那么面对支持中小企业的发展来出台的一项关于加强知识产权质押融资与评估管理工作的一项政策。那么由于时间关系，在这儿不详细的介绍。那么关于试点工作，那么我们先后这些年间在29个地区开展了试点工作。那么有29个地区的政府在上述政策的导引下，那么政府积极的推动，那么开展了质押融资的试点、投融资的服务试点，还创建了投融资综合的一个实验区。具体的工作呢，是通过加强知识产权融资的动态调整和评估的专业服务，组建知识产权投融资服务联盟，建设投融资信息服务平台等多种渠道来推进融资工作、投融资工作。那第二呢，就是开展了专利保险的试点工作，选择了27个地区开展专利保险试点，主要是利用保险的补偿和普惠性，那么来降低企业维权的成本。模式呢，就是进行保费的补贴、购买中介服务、保险合作机构优惠服务、费率调整等等。具体的工作呢，涉及政策宣讲、媒体宣传、企业需求、组织培训、调研、优化业务服务。那么组织的相关的培训和业务服务都是上百场的培训。那么另外呢，国家知识产权局 CIPO 直接和这个中国交通银行，那么建立了面向中小企业的知识产权金融服务战略合作协议，建立了全方位的面向中小企业的知识产权服务的战略合作关系以及常态化的对接机制。那么另外呢，和中国人民财产保险有限公司签署了合作协议，共同推进专利保险工作，在险种的开发、试点的推广、风险的控制、业务流程的规范及优化方面开展了大量的工作。那么第四个呢，就是在面向中小企业加强服务机制建设方面。那么首先呢，简化规范登记手续，那么合同质押的一些登记手续。第二个呢，是开展金融服务活动，加强在质押项目知识产权保护和后续动态的跟踪服务。那么召开相关的培训班，那么开展相关的研究和服务机构的培养。那么第三个呢，就是加强人才的培养，那么举办编写培训教材，引进一些培训的书籍，为整个知识产权金融服务人才的培养奠定了一个基础。那么经过这4项的措施，那么目前我们的一个工作效果是什么呢？那么工作效果就是在专利权质押融资方面，那么从2011年到13年，我们国家专利权质押融资金额分别为11年是91亿，12年是141亿，13年是254亿人民币。那么融资金额年均的增长是68%。那么从11年以来增长的尤其快，实际上这项工作的启动是从08年就开始了。那么它的收效呢是近年逐步的得到体现。那么在后续的发展过程当中，它会得到进一步的体现和提升。那么惠及了2700多家中小微企业。那么今年1月到5月，我国专利权质押投融资金额已经达到，今年就是半年的时间，那么小半年的时间已经达到193亿元人民币，这个趋势跟我刚才给大家讲的是一样的。那第二，在专利保险方面，从2012年到2013年，我们国家有53家企业投保专利执行保险，涉及专利是1855件，那么保障的金额就保险额是6438万元。那么目前专利质押融资和专利保险方面，那么所面临的问题，事实上就像我们所说的，刚才的政策其实涉及到2个方面。 一方面是政府的推进政策，一方面是具体业务的专业性指导性政策。那么目前的问题呢，主要在这个业务方面。那么在这个质押融资方面呢，那存在专利价值评估体系，那么还需要进一步的完善。那现有的评估方法，比如说我们这个专利权人他的这个投资的这个评估方法呢，往往是从成本和收益的角度，而银行呢，它的观察点是说我退出这个机制的时候，它的这种变现能力，那么观察点是不一样的。而且呢，另外呢，知识产权还有很多不确定性，比如说专利，它的保护年限随着时间的推移，它的保护年限逐渐在缩短，它和其他的一些有形财产就不一样。比如说，有些有形财产随着时间的推移，它是增值的，而作为知识产权这样一个有限定额度的，特别是专利这样一段时期内的一个保护来说，随着时间的推移，应该说整体从它的价值实现的这种收益的角度来看，它是缩小的。那么有很多不确定的因素。那么还有呢，就是交易市场还不够成熟。我们现在有基础性的交易市场，未来还应该构建分领域的专业化的交易市场，最后在这个市场体系下再构建更高端的证券化的交易市场。那么第二，关于专利保险，那么比如说保险的供给方，那么就是保险公司会觉得说这种保险呢，因为它对整个的这个知识产权相关的，它不是从创新一开始就进入的，那么只是在运用这个环节进入的，那么就是说它对它的这个理解和对它的投资点和对它的清晰判断都还不够明确，所以呢风险很高。那么另外呢，需求方就是这投保方呢，对这项工作认知度还不够高，那么整个的服务链条还不够完整，那么等等这些方面的问题。那么面对这些问题，下一步我们将从4个方面来推进、来改进、来不断完善这项工作。那么第一个是创建公共服务机制，第二是完善风险控制机制，第三是建立市场化的运行体系，第四是激发市场的一个需求。如果没有一个需求，那我们这个供给市场再好，我们知识产权金融服务提供的再好，产业和企业界它没有这样一个需求，专利权人没有这样一个需求，那么这个生态系统也是构建不起来的。那么我们从4个方面，首先呢，创建公共的服务机制，那么要鼓励各类的中介服务机构、金融机构，那么投入到这项工作当中。那么第二呢，是出台政策支持这个整个过程的这个中介服务的一些费用。第三个呢，是构建中小企业和商业银行、保险公司之间的这个信息交流平台，提供一个中小企业知识产权保护的，提高他们的运用水平。第二呢，是完善这个风险控制机制，那要探索建立知识产权融资风险多方分担的机制，在融资环节中引入担保保险机制来分担银行和担保机构的风险。二呢，是推动设立职权处置周转专项资金，为职权处置和贷款回收提供适当的周转途径和时间。那么支持银行和投资机构开展合作，通过投资联动的模式拓展企业的融资渠道。第四是鼓励保险公司那么引入再保险机制和建立投保的这个专利风险评级制度来分散经营的风险。那第五呢，是建立市场化的运行机制，那是我刚才讲的推动知识产权交易市场的建立，创新知识产权金融产品，引导中介机构参与专利投融资和保险工作。第五，最后是促进这个市场需求体系的建设， 那在这一方面呢，主要是加强企业层面和产业层面的知识产权运用能力的这样一个提高。那在企业层面，去年3月份，中国发布了企业知识产权管理国家标准。那么它把我们知识产权的创造、运用、保护和管理变成一种企业版的模式，通过这个在企业的立项、采购、生产、经营、销售全过程，把知识产权的创造、运用、保护、管理融入其中，提供了一套过程化的模板，然后采取标准化的手段在企业当中推行。那么通过这样一个推行呢，来提升企业的知识产权运用能力。那么随着它运用能力的提升，那么作为金融服务，作为一个运用手段，也会得到更多的企业的应用。那么另外在产业层面，我们推出了专利导航产业发展试点工程，那面向产业聚集区、行业和产业里的龙头企业开展专利导航试点工作，也就是正如刚才美国代表所介绍的，从创新的源头开始介入，那么围绕市场需求来部署创新链、知识产权链，围绕知识产权链来部署创新链，围绕创新链来部署资金链和政策链，那么最后形成一个知识产权的有效的布局，最后通过知识产权的金融服务和产业化的手段，促进知识产权的应用和价值实现，最后完成创新的生态。那么随着这个专利导航产业发展的这个试点工作的推行，那么产业界也会更多的运用知识产权金融服务这个手段来促进知识产权的运用。相信随着我们这个重点工作的不断完善和改善，那么知识产权金融服务会有更大的空间，会有更多的服务模式，会给经济带来更大的贡献。谢谢。
Thank you for your presentation. 레이 샤오윤 정책관님께서 중국 정부의 IP금융 서비스 정책 추진 방향에 대해 소개해 주셨습니다. 귀한 발표 감사드리고요. 마찬가지로 여러분께서 직접 질문해 주신 질의응답 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 첫 번째 질문입니다. 정부 주도 외에 민간에서 자발적으로 이루어지고 있는 IP 투자, IP 비즈니스가 중국에 있는지 답변 부탁드립니다.
这个问题提得很好，也许是我刚才讲的还不够细。那么政府是总体的在环境上推动，那么具体的参与呢，有政府资金的介入的这种模式，也有完全的民间资本的这种投入。在这样一个大的环境下，那么很多的民间资本都积极的投入到这个工作当中来。那么我刚才讲的这些投融资的额度，也包括很多民间的资本。谢谢。
감사드립니다. 제가 알아듣고 싶은데 중국어라서 네, 이해를 잘 못하겠네요. 자, 두 번째 질문 드리겠습니다. 중국은 지식재산 거래소가 있다고 알고 있습니다. 지식재산 거래소가 지식재산의 실질적인 거래를 활성화하기 위해서 어떤 기능을 하고 있는지 알고 싶고요. 그리고 한국은 또 어떤 노력을 해야 할지도 답변 부탁드립니다.
关于知识产权交易的问题，中国的知识产权交易所目前呢有普通的技术交易所，里面包含有知识产权。另外呢还有专门的知识产权展示交易中心，有40多所。但是呢前期他们开展的工作呢主要是基础性的，比如说专利的拍卖，还有呢一些专利的展示和交易活动。 那么下一步呢，我们想呢，根据这个随着我们导航工程的推进呢，我们想建立分产业领域的专业化的交易机制、交易平台。那么交易所呢，要往专业化的交易方面发展。我想呢，这样一个观点呢，也应该就是说和韩国方面是共享的。谢谢。
감사드립니다. 세 번째 질문 가도록 하겠습니다. IP 담보대출을 받은 기업이 대출금을 갚지 못할 경우 은행은 어떻게 대출금을 회수하는지 답변 부탁드립니다.
实际上在这个担保的这个机制方面，那还有很多的设计，包括银行那么给他做这样一个投资的话，就是说质押能够得到银行的这个贷款的话，它有很多的机制。那么首先银行对这个本身的，比如说是一个专利权，它要进行综合的考量。此外，对这个企业的信誉也要进行综合的考量，这是一种直接贷款的模式。另外呢，它还有担保公司的介入，还可以通过就是银行的这个专利权，比如说知识产权和股权共同来作为一个质押物的方式，还可以把它的收益权作为一个质押物，它有多种方式。
Thank you very much. 시간 관계상 이 질문을 마지막으로 하도록 하겠습니다. 이상으로 질의응답을 모두 마치도록 하겠습니다. 레이 샤오윤님께 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드립니다. 다음 세션을 위해서 통역 소신기는 좌석에 두고 가주시기 바랍니다. 감사합니다.